everybody. My name is Claudio Tessone. I am professor of blockchain and distributed ledger technologies at the University of Zurich. And we have had a long-term collaboration with Cardano in different aspects that relate to the research, in which we have been developing research in Cardano, first doing analytics, trying to understand economic processes that are happening in Cardano, both at the level of staking, distribution, and long-term sustainability of staking policies, and then looking at the economic functioning of Cardano as a whole. Now we are changing a little bit the focus on the research that we are performing towards governance elements in Cardano, and I will present basically the preliminary take that we are making on how to analyze on-chain governance in Cardano specifically, and in general for other layers ones as well. But having a focus on Cardano for obvious reasons, not only in the presentation, but also in terms of the research that we are performing. One thing that is very important is that we always need to bear in mind that blockchain-based systems are complex socio-technical systems. They are not just a technical infrastructure that we are running stuff on. They are also that, but they are not only that. And the reason for why I'm saying this using this term of complexity is because the global properties that these systems have depend on collective behavior of a lot of agents, and these agents act for different reasons. They may exchange value with each other. They may, for example, position their own opinions with respect to voting. They may stake on others, be it in terms of the voting rights, or be it in order to participate in the consensus protocol. And always, the actions of these agents are triggered by design choices. How they design the system is going to completely change the way in which the agents interact with each other. Okay, you have indirect measures, like, for example, changing monetary policy will affect the economic functioning of some agents and how they will exchange value. And also how we design voting mechanisms is going to crucially affect as well how people make decisions. And that's why when we are talking about design choices, we need to understand that we are talking not only about the technical design of blockchain-based systems, but also the economic incentives that we place on them, and also, as I say, the governance model that we have. And in the long run, they become all intertwined. We also have to remember that blockchains, we like it or not, are highly competitive environments, and in most of the cases, users end up trying to maximize profits. In most of the cases, even if this weakens the system they are running on, you have multiple examples of this. You have, in proof-of-work-based systems, you have people doing selfish mining. In Ethereum and other account-based blockchains, you have people exerting MEVs, even if this creates a very thin layer of trust in completely unknown parties, and very few, actually, with a lot of centralization. And because of this, whenever we are designing anything that relates to how the agents work, what we have to bear in mind is what we need to do is to trigger specific kinds of behavior on the participants of the system. We are not designing here protocols. We are not designing technical protocols. We are steering behavior of individuals in a specific manners. And this is what our final aim should be towards. Before I start to talk about governance in Cardano, I want to talk about things that crucially affect the way in which people make decisions in general, whenever we have to make decisions, and that highlight the effects of how complex the system, the process of making decisions are. And the issue is that whenever we are making decisions on something, we live in a very complex world in which there is a lot of interconnectedness and a lot of side effects of what we want to do. And in a way, the decisions that we make in one area may crucially affect others. So whenever we are designing a governance mechanism, one of the questions that we want to answer is, who is the one that knows what must be done? This is the first question that we always have in a governance mechanism. And how do we decide who these parties are? How do we give power to some parties? Eventually, once decisions have been made in terms of governance, the question that we always have to answer is how we're going to implement the decisions. And over time, human societies have taken different approaches towards this. On the one case, for example, in terms of who knows what we need to do, over history we have been trying to address different people. Do we tell the church that is the one that tells us what we need to do? That was the first of the options. Then eventually we ended up having states that took over most of the power, since nation states and the Illuminism in 18th century. And eventually now, with the rise of centralized platforms that we all give our data to, in many cases we also have just corporations that are deciding which is the content that we see and how. Okay? And actually we surrender our rights towards these entities constantly. We have also found multiple ways in who is the one that decides. We have democracies in many places of the world, but we also have had other kinds of governments, monarchies, oligarchies, that have taken over the decision-making process. And in general, how do we implement the decisions has been always done top-down. And as also Professor Tapscott was mentioning yesterday, in general, it has always been argued that hierarchies are very efficient at triggering specific kinds of behavior and implementing, okay, with all the drawbacks as well that hierarchies have as well in the long run. Let me give you a simple example that is somehow related to what we are going to say, but it's going to allow me to highlight specific elements that always happen when we, as a society, make decisions, and which are the unintended consequences that decisions may have. And the example that I picked is the one about the reduction of CO2 emissions. And governments in general implement different kinds of policies. They may implement, for example, top-down policies. Governments always implement top-down measures. And this is, I already say, taking top-down measures to govern society in general is quite inefficient, because top-down system planners in general only are able to maximize or to optimize very simple measures. So with respect to the CO2 emissions, for example, it may be that a government decides to create subsidies to, for example, guarantee specific prices of electricity if they are produced with biogas. Or they can also decide to force by law to reduce CO2 emissions by selling especially kinds of petrol that contain larger ranges of biogas. And then, however, when you implement these kind of policies, remember I said the government subsidizes the range of biogas, the production of biogas. It may have a side effect, which is that eventually you end up having a lot of monocultures, for example, that is happening in Europe and specifically in Germany. And exactly because you have monocultures in some countries, you end up having to outsource the production of other things, like, for example, of meat to other places in the world, like, for example, Brazil, which ends up deforesting. And this is a cascade effect of other decisions that are taking place outside of the original environment. And out of this, you have feedback loops out of the decisions that eventually may lead to other things, like, for example, faster global warming. And every time that we are making decisions in society, the problem is that we have a lot of these effects are caused by links between different elements that we are trying to govern. And in general, you have emergent behavior, which means that you only observe it at the global level, even if microscopically, looking at the interactions between agents, they affect very little. And because the system is so interconnected, you have a complexity that is ever growing, okay? And then it is harder and harder to try to control systems top-down. That's why you need to try to design governance mechanisms that are bottom-up. We were trying to discuss about these questions and how do we try to address them in practice when we try to, why is it that voting is so good to try to solve the problems? And this is the last part in which I'm not talking about Cardano, but I am talking specifically, or not precisely about on-chain governance, but gives a picture of the kind of approaches that why democracy works or why distributed decision-making actually is a good idea. And one of the mechanisms that we always talk about or that is spoken about in these environments is the so-called collective intelligence. Collective intelligence is an interesting phenomenon. One of the simplest examples is that of wisdom of the crowds. But wisdom of the crowds, that I will explain in the next slide, works only. Give me a second. I should explain. Wisdom of the crowds is something that was discovered in the early 20th century. There was this mathematician, Galton, who in the early 20th century decided to do the following. He put an ox in the front of a lot of people and asked independently to each one of the people that was staring at the ox, which was the weight of the ox. And over time, what they realized, what he found actually is that each one of the individual guesses of how much the ox weighs was far off or not necessarily close to it. However, on average, all the crowd was able to perfectly determine with a very high precision to determine the weight of the ox. And if he changed the ox to one larger, to one smaller, always the guesses were very good, okay? And this works, wisdom of the crowds work, as long as you have different elements in your decision. The typical other example that exists about wisdom of the crowds is guessing how many marbles you have in a jar, okay? And one of the things is that you need that each one of the participants in the system has access to unbiased information about what they are seeing. They cannot see a distorted ox, you need to see the actual one. Importantly, you need access to information, opinion formation, must be independently done for this to work. Otherwise, wisdom of the crowds does not work. If you have biases or if you have correlations in the opinion of the people, this will not work. And the other is, as long as you come up with an idea, you need to be able to freely express this idea. Okay? And these are fundamental when we are thinking about decision-making processes in which we try to distribute the decision. There is a challenge, however, because actually this is why it is always argued that doing DAOs is a good idea, because you are distributing the decision. There is another, talking with the postdoc that helped me to produce this research. One thing that she told me was actually actually it's the Indian tradition. They have this story about a blind men and an elephant, in which you have blind men, they start to touch different parts of an elephant. And each one of them, while describing what they are touching, nobody is able to understand that they are touching an elephant because they only have a partial picture of what they are doing, okay? And actually, when we are making decisions in voting, my point is that because we have limited cognitive capacity, we are much closer in many of the contexts to the metaphor of the elephant than to the collective wisdom. Because we always end up making decisions with limited information, but if we want to solve properly the issue at hand, what we need to do is to have proper communication, because if the blind men are able to describe what they are touching, all of them independently, the problem gets solved. Okay, so communication is necessary, and you need a common, interconnected process of opinion formation. So, which is the one that describes better? I think that it is a mixture of the two. And we need to take into account this when we are thinking of making decision-making processes. I want to briefly refer to you some of the things that we always observe when we have decision-making and voting in practice, because this is fundamental when we want to make and design a new decision-making process in something as complicated as a blockchain. Okay? And one thing that you see is that for different reasons, one of them is going to be explained in a second, every time that you have voting, the more people have time to discuss issues at hand, the more you end up in hung election scenarios, which means that the call is too close with each other. This happens all the time in elections. So the more people go, the more you tend towards this direction. One of the reasons is that people have a tendency to, on the one side, whenever you have something at hand, you try to revolutionize the world, and the more you discuss, the more people want to preserve the status quo. And this is something that happens. And exactly because this thing happens, it is very difficult to just have simple majorities in decisions that can be fundamental for a change in the system. But also, the way in which it is framed may have crucial effects on how people perceive that an issue at stake is just preserving the status quo or completely changing the stuff, and this will once again change the outcome. We have digital voting, and this is the experience if you know how different DAOs have been working in different protocols, be it in Ethereum, be it in, in DAOs, in EVM-compatible blockchains, but also in other block layer ones that had a governance mechanism inside. One of the challenges that you have with this is that if you are able to change your vote, to cast your vote, and eventually change it, a typical observation is that people, what they end up doing is voting in one direction, and knowing that their vote can completely change the outcome, they vote in the opposite way in which they would actually like to vote, just to completely flip their casted vote seconds before the deadline and changing the result. And only changing the result if it, and changing the vote only if it changes the final result. Okay, so this is a tricky kind of behavior that is enabled by a blockchain-based systems. The other thing is, how do we have a fair representation if you have an environment that is not civil resistant? Because here we are able to create create multiple identities. And the way in which people have been solving this is, in general, trying to have even delegated voting or making one vote per token owned, which also creates inequalities, as we will see in a second. Another thing that is very important and very difficult to solve in these systems is you have a lot of conflicts of interest between parties, and the topics on which they are voting in general affect them greatly. And how do you fix this thing is something that is particularly important to try to solve as well. Let us remember, just to conclude this introductory part, is that blockchains act like dark forests. There is this book by Xixin Liu that is called, that is the three-body problem. It's the second part of the three-body problem that is called the dark forest, that has a very interesting hypothesis. And actually, systems in which you have a lot of adversarials or people that want to maximize their own wealth behave pretty much like this. And with this, we are saying that every time that there is an opportunity to given by the rules to exploit the system, people will end up doing that. And this is why it is so difficult to, it's so challenging to design blockchain-based systems as a whole, but specifically governance ones. Okay? This is what I was saying before. So why is it that we want on-chain governance? The typical narrative that is built around this is because we want decentralized governance, we have more inclusive one, we want to have enhanced transparency, fostering an engaged community, having this skin in the game thing, perhaps also incentivizing participation. And the other reason is that perhaps this also allows us to stabilize a specific token economy, because we may limit the amount of circulating assets that we have inside of the economy if people need to lock it in order to be able to vote. So these are all the reasons in which we have. However, as most of the blockchain-based voting is implemented, you have a lot of power concentration. Unfortunately, you also have a very high level of apathy between the voters. You end up having low voter participation. And if you are making choices to modify, for example, a protocol, reverting back from bad decisions is something that is very hard. And also what is a bad decision is something that has to be clearly identified. That's why it is very difficult to penalize as well when this thing happens. Because of the same metaphor of the elephant, also the problem that you have is that in many of the decision-making processes, you also have a lot of lack of expertise between the people that need to develop to make the decisions to vote. But on the other side is if you have delegation, you end up having, as we will see, a lot of centralized voting power. The goals that we have, if we want to do that, is trying to have a decentralized governance, and this is the challenge that when you are trying to move from a centralized decision-making process to a decentralized one, the transformation is very hard, and Cardano was very successful when transitioning the protocol itself, but this was at the technical level. Now we are talking merely about something that is organizational, and that's why it is far more challenging. And so the two things that you want to do is have this decentralized governance appearing, and on the other side, a fair representation of the different stakeholders. So let us see how the things have been going in the Voltaire era so far. The decision-making process or the voting in the Voltaire era basically mean that we have one Lovelace, one vote. You have voting proportional to the amount of tokens that are placed in a specific DREPs. Okay? And therefore, the idea is that in this onset of this era, you want to arrive to a period in which you want people to stake and to show that they are participating in the decision-making processes. Let us first look into, so staking is in a way, once again, transitioning from staking only in order to receive rewards and participate of the consensus mechanism, as well to create, to be an important part of the mechanism by which people express also their decisions or support others of participating in their decisions. As I was explaining at the beginning of this presentation, we have been doing a lot of analysis in terms of how the staking dynamics have been working in Cardano. And in the first plot here, one thing that you can see, is that the number of active pools that you have in Cardano has been continuously growing over the eras, roughly 3,000 or something like that. And on average, you have always the same number of delegators per pool inside of Cardano. And this translates into two things. On the one side is that the total active stakes that is staked in all the staking pools has been increasing, as at plateauing in the last years. And because of the economic policy of Cardano, you have that these total rewards have been decreasing over time because the treasury has less and less reserves, and always the rewards are proportional to what is left in the treasury. One thing that is interesting actually is that over time, the number of pools that get retired in every era has been decreasing, and that's why it's a kind of a stable situation from that point of view. If we were analyzing this, it's because we want to understand how the staking behavior and monetary forecasting eventually lead to the long-term sustainability of proof-of-stake-based systems, and in this case, Cardano. And what you see, we have created, we have a couple of papers, that in which we link the monetary policy of a delegated proof-of-stake-based systems, and here I'm showing what is happening in Cardano, with the reward distributions and how they are decided. And one thing that we have always to bear in mind is that in Cardano you have all this saturation. You have the limits of how much people can participate inside of the the rewards. And that's why you have this decentralization in the size of the staking pools. And if I am saying, if I am making explicit mention to this fact, is because in Cardano, now, in terms of governance, there are no limits in how much weight the reps can get, okay? So what we were doing in this kind of modeling framework is linking the monetary policy of the Cardano. Sorry, I was talking about treasury. It's the reserves that is what receives the rewards, not the treasury. So what happens is that you have an implemented monetary policy, and what we have been modeling, and that's why the two plots here, even if they are eventless, which is a good thing, are actually quite information rich. What you have in the model is what we are modeling actually the behavior of delegators, how they select the staking pools, okay? And this is the prediction of the model in blue. So it has a lot of information, each one of these points. It has 3,000 staking pools and hundreds of thousands of validators, tens of thousands of delegators. And in red, we have the actual empirical analysis of this, okay? And when you look, I am still talking about staking. When you look at this, what you have is on the one side that you have a very large concentration in power of who are the who are the staking pools actually, which is the share of blocks that each of the validators have, which is the share also of stakes that they have inside of the system. But importantly, this is an input, okay? This is the distribution of staking pool sizes on the left, and which is very skewed. But on the right, what we have is measures that look into the distribution of rewards in the active SPOs over the different epochs in Cardano. And what you see is that you remember that there was this parameter change there in the epoch 2240, something like this. And this completely changed, decreased a lot the inequality in reward distributions of the different staking pools, and increased a lot the Nakamoto coefficient of the Cardano peer-to-peer network, which is a very interesting achievement. It's one of the largest Nakamoto indices that you can have in a proof-of-stake-based blockchain. But importantly, even if the Gini index decreased, you see that eventually it started to grow again. So the policy implemented had a relatively low, short-lived effect, and then eventually the system converged to a different equilibrium. So what happens is that, and what we observe always in Cardano and in other proof-of-stake, delegated proof-of-stake-based blockchains, is that you have concentration of power that becomes more and more centralized over time because of the inherent nature of a delegated proof-of-stake, which is rewarding more the one that produces more, that is the one that already has more than others. This is what was happening at the level of proof-of-stake. So how this is going to happen when we transition towards governance in this case, okay? And now the road is not so necessarily sunny as it was before. We know which are the different roles that we have in voting in Cardano. And specifically, you have the Constitutional Committee, you have the DREPs, you have the staking pool operators, because what you want to do is to avoid the conflict of interest between the SPOs and the others. However, a question that we have is, are actually SPOs trying to participate in the rest of the actions, which is the effect that different design choices may have in this? And we analyzed actually what is happening now in the era that finished last week, in the epoch that finished last week, when so far have been 3 active governance actions in the system. And from an economic point of view, these are the numbers. You have 36 billion of circulating ADAs. You have an active stake of 22 billion. And the this is the total stakes through the SPOs, but you only have 400 million ADAs that are delegated to the reps. Okay, so it is only 5% if I get the number right. And there are basically, the numbers also vastly differ in terms of the delegators. One thing that is important, and this is a crucial point here, is this Venn diagram this yellow Venn diagram is the total amount of accounts that you have with more than one ADA. It's 2.6 million. You have, as I said, 2.8K pools that have a non-zero stake. You have, from the accounts that have more than 500 ADAs, you have 700K of these accounts, and you have 500 registered DREPs. Okay, you have active DREPs 400, and they were already voted as DREPs 300 ones. So the question that we have now is, actually these sets intersect. So how does everything look like here? This is the question that we are going to try to address now. First of all, what you have, this is the growth that you have so far in epochs in the number of accounts that are registered as DREPs. And you see that now the total number of delegators per DREP is very, very low, actually. It's less than 10. And the delegated stake on voting has been also plateauing. That is exactly what I was saying related to the general apathy that you may have inside of these systems. Okay? And once again, when you look at the distribution of delegators, how many delegators they have, you see that actually, once again, it's a very skewed distribution, and always they have very few. It only reaches 100 in this case. So how, on the one side, we have a participation rate that is very low, but on the other side, when you look into the analysis of how much, which is the total stake that both the reps and the staking pool operators have, what you have is that the distribution of stakes by the rep, this is a so-called zip plot, in which in the x-axis you have the pools or the reps ordered by the amount of stake. And to the right, the first plot is the one with the largest stake, the second is the second largest, etc., etc., etc. And what you see actually is that even if the distribution of stakes inside of SPOs is very unequal, you have a Gini index of 0.83, okay? In DREPs it's even worse, okay? You have a lot of concentration in voting power inside of the DREPs that are there. And one thing that we argue is that the lack of saturation for DREPs is what is causing a higher inequality. What is concerning is that if you look at the total voting power, you see that with that the Nakamoto coefficient of the DREPs is 4. Okay, 4 DREPs control more than 50% of all the stakes. So even if the voting power of both the SPOs and the DREPs is concentrated, for the DREPs is even larger the level of inequality with respect to what was happening with SPOs. Okay, and as I said, Cardano has been very successful in decentralizing the operations of the peer-to-peer network. When we look into how these three actions happened, we only had info action so far, so there was no very contentious issues inside of the system. What you see is that actually, in terms of the reps, you had, this is the outcome that you had in the action so far. And what you see is that because of this, and also because there is very little data, we are waiting for more actions to happen to have a better and to implement a much more detailed modeling framework. What is happening so far is that because of the eventless nature of the action so far, there has not been people trying to do strategic behavior, but this does not mean that it would not happen in other cases. So we know that there is a relation between SPO and the reps, and the question trying to look into it and to measure it is maybe useful, because then we can understand which is the actual distribution of power inside of the system, also in terms of decision making. Because, as you know, pool owners can also register as DREPs or delegate to DREPs instead of acting only and voting only as SPOs. That is one of the rights that they have. Okay, and when you look into this, what you see is that actually this is the link that exists between DREPs. DREPs are in the left, and in the right you have staking pool operators. Okay, and you see that actually you have families of staking pool operators that are all delegating and registering as the same DREP. Okay, and that also this also showing why they are much more concentrated, because in some cases actually the staking pool operators are just consolidating all the tokens into a specific DREPs for act as a voting, basically to consolidate all the votes there. So we have 144 pairs between DREPs and staking pools, which involve 6% of the total delegated stake. Okay. The only caveat that we have with respect to this result is that, of course, there are many more links between DREPs and SPOs. The numbers that we have is because we know exactly that these DREPs, these are SPOs that are also registered as, are delegating, sorry, in a specific DREPs. So how do we try to trigger a governance design? On the one side, we more or less extending our work on staking. We are now trying to create a general framework to on-chain governance, and this is what we will do in the next year in my team. First, we will look into voting design. For example, trying to have a generic framework that allows to set up different voting policies in which you have different voting roles, action categories, decision-making processes, and what leads to outcomes, which is the behavior of voters and a delegation. As you have seen, we have been quite successful at reproducing this from the level of delegators to SPOs. But also, importantly, we'll try to see which are the strategic behavior that that on the one side delegators, but also the reps may have. And the question is also that is a very tense, I don't know if tense, but there is an ongoing discussion inside of the communities, how we are going to incentivize participation for voting. Are we going to try to seek for decentralization as well in the decision-making process? Do we want to have an egalitarian representation in which all of the participants have the same weight? Are going to have unbiased incentives to different kinds of opinions or not? I think that this is actually an important part, because these are opinions. You should not frustrate people that is, for example, losing a vote if you cannot prove that this is happening. And then we will have the evaluation phase of all this modeling framework. I will now concentrate on two specific assets. I will now focus on two specific issues related to voting. That is, do we really want to have one token, one vote? Or do we really want to have 50% majority to approve specific motions, specific actions? Okay. Let us go back first on the one token, one vote. On the one side, this is a simple thing that you can do in a civil environment in which you do not have good notions of identity. And also in theory, it is based on the assumption that the higher stakes you have in the system, the more important for you is the success of the ecosystem in the long term. Okay. Also, it has the positive outcome that it conduces to reduces total token liquidity. The problem is that this also has because naturally wealth is distributed in a very unequal manner. This power concentration is an issue for voting in this way. Okay, and specifically in a proof-of-stake-based system in which this is just naturally growing over time. Also, you have a lot of participants, many that are very small, that will not participate will feel that they cannot contribute in the decision-making process, and this creates more apathy in the system. And also, as it has happened in many DAOs, wherever you can think of, you have also economic manipulation that may happen inside of the system. liquid democracy is one of the solutions that in general is tried to think, but one thing that we will propose in the next slides is actually, we think that a reputation-based system in which an alternative dimension to that of wealth is something that is fundamental for you to express and to value and to gauge how much you will contribute to the decision-making process. On the other side, for example, time weighted is another measure that can be taken, how long you have been holding the age of the tokens that you have, and this is something that is very simple to do in an UTXO-based blockchain. Is something that actually is an important aspect because you can prevent these things like, for example, buying votes from in a specific action. Good. The concern that we have with respect to the simple majority is, on the one side, is this hung voting scenario that is happening constantly in human societies. And the upside that this thing has is that it is a very simple rule. It's just the majority. Also, it prevents deadlocks. However, you also, because of these hung voting scenarios, you always have that slight majorities, or it is very common that slight majorities end up imposing this decision to very close contestants. That's why what we are proposing in terms of measurement of the work of these systems is we have introduced some parameters as part of this framework that we are developing. One of them is the degree of consent that you have inside of the system. This index, and we measured it in the different issues that you had so far in Cardano, is an index that tells you basically which is the difference between yes and no, normalized by the rate of abstentions that you have inside of the voting. Okay, the more abstentions you have, the less large, the smaller this index is. And the larger the difference between expressed opinions, yes and no, the larger the index will be. And what you see is actually that, as I say, the first two issues were quite non-contentious. There was quite a large consensus inside of the decision in the on-chain voting. However, the last one had a very small difference that actually with the abstentions you roughly end up inside of the same range of the abstentions. Okay, so the abstentions would have been enough almost to overturn the election, and that's why the level of consent related to the third choice actually is much less clear than with the others. When this coefficient that I was describing is very small, what you have is that you have a lot of dissent inside of the population, and that's why you should be much more concerned on whether you accept or not a specific issue. And that's why what we argue is that if in these things happen, you should give more chance the community to keep discussing the issue and even perhaps change the vote for a longer time, or have successive votes of rounds of voting. But what we think is that what indices that allow us to understand which is the level of agreement that you have in the community is something that is important to signal thresholds to adoption. And the last issue that is specifically important inside of this kind of decision-making is, do we have to incentivize voting? Okay, because people is participating in governance. And it's a very delicate situation, because if you want to express your opinion, in general, you are not rewarded for this. Perhaps in some countries you are penalized if you do not express your opinion rather than the opposite. But one thing that is important is that when you have a liquid system like in Cardano, at the end of the day, there are some, these reps are taking the responsibility for the decisions of the others. So perhaps because they are offering a service, they're using part of their time, it may be reasonable to pay them. There were different schemes that most likely you have been hearing already inside of the Cardano community on how people should be incentivized for the DREPs, not all the people, but only the DREPs that are participating in the decision-making process, how they should be incentivized. And even if there is a family of these ones, the problem that you have is that over time, you always have increased inequality and, on the one side, increased apathy or more concentration of power in fewer and fewer actors. And the situation is not very good in terms of concentration, as you have been seeing so far. So at the end of the day, none of these systems address the important issues that you have in the systems. Because what we want to limit, for example, is the damage that strategic voting may have in the community. Whether, for example, you have timely voting that allows for robust opinions that allow you to have trust, actually, in all the decision-making process. Because if you know that people is acting in a trustworthy manner, that they will not flip in the last second just to change actually what they wanted to vote all the time, if you do not do that, you decrease the trust that you have in the way in which people is making decisions. So it is a very difficult trade-off that, because on the one side you have economic incentives, increase the participation on voting, or at least the engagement of the reps, they also highly bias the voting behavior, and they do not prevent a lot of the issues, like, for example, conflict of interest, etc. And importantly, as we also have seen in this analysis so far, in the three cases that were applied so far, in the three actions that were voted so far, if you do not have matching rewards for the SPOs, remember you have three decision-making bodies, SPOs, DREPs, and the Constitutional Council. If you do not incentivize the SPOs, perhaps they prefer to act as the reps because they are incentivized. Once again, creating even more correlation in the opinions inside of the reps. That is exactly the opposite of what we wanted to do, to have functioning decision-making processes. I was explaining with examples of the ox and the elephant. Which is the way in which we can try to promote this, and this is where I am going to start. What we are now doing research on is the following. Our proposal would be actually that you have reputation-based systems inside of in the voting. Okay, you have a sort of reputation credits, and reputation credits are multidimensional. Reputation credits are not tokens, are perhaps another families of tokens that represent how reputable a DREP is. And they can represent, as I say, different dimensions. Here we were mentioning, I will mention only four. For example, how often a DREP is participating, how timely are the votings, and how stable or assertive the decisions are. It is not that it is changing at the last time. It is actually enabling others to make decisions based on their own trusted information. And for example, a participation rate has two aspects. On the one side, one thing is voting. The other thing is acting in a thoughtful manner with respect to voting. That's why having checkpoints in which you are testing whether the reps are actually paying attention or just voting to get the reputation, that is not a reward, is something, not necessarily a reward at least, not necessarily a reward, is something that is important as well to have. Importantly, because it is what happens always in reputation, reputation it has two components. Either it increases a little bit or decreases a little bit out of your actions, but eventually it decays over time if you do not do anything. It's not that you earn the reputation and it just stays there or moves very little if you act bad. Okay, reputation is something that you need to keep constantly as part of the engagement. That's why in general models of reputation have a set decay in which over time it is just naturally vanishing if you do not keep acting inside of the community. This reputation system has two mutually interesting effects. On the one side, for the token holders, you are going to be more likely giving the representation to people that is actually have trusted representatives. On the other side, the representatives are going to be much more vigilant in the way in which they are making decisions and allowing some of the way in which they vote, because they know that they can suffer if they are not acting right in terms of decision making. And you see that here we are not valuing whether someone is voting in favor of against a specific position. The only thing that we are valuing is that the reps actually are acting as the decision-making process mandates. Eventually, one can think of rewards, but only based on the reputation that the people has been having. And honestly speaking, if I were to say something, I would say that the rewards should be non-monetary. Okay, should not be in aid as well either. But this is a different story. As we said, we are trying to combine in this modeling framework that we are developing, and with the indices that I was describing and others, how to design the voting, exploring different alternatives, looking into the things that Cardano community has been proposing, trying to get new ones and measuring them, and we will keep you in the loop. Just as take-home messages, let us remember that on-chain governance is not a technical problem that we need to solve. It's the most challenging issue with respect to social processes that can happen in a community like Cardano. And on the one side, you need to balance different things. You want to have broad participation, but as in the same sense, fair and efficiency in the decisions that we are making. One argument, and we had a very interesting conversation yesterday about this with Massimo. The one thing that you cannot do is try to, for example, aggregate decisions just to make people decide on less things because of the elephant metaphor that we had before. Okay, the less the people know, the more informed the decisions are going to be made, and this is a challenge. And what we stand is that combining reputation systems with economic rewards may motivate fair long-term participation, but only if it is done right. Because in general, you have a lot of economic processes that lead to concentration of wealth and of power if you are not doing right. Cardano did it right with saturating the participation that people can have in staking pools, but this is not what is happening at the level of representation. The last thing that I wanted to say, and with this I close, is that so far we do not match how to design blockchains, okay? But also we do not know much yet about how to design on-chain governance. So it's very unlikely that we will get it right as well the first time that we implement it. So we need to know and to understand how we are able to change the mechanisms and do it timely and not die in the attempt. The last thing I want to say is that most of the work was done by a postdoc in my team, Sheng Nan Ni, who could not come in this Cardano Summit. I hope that she can make it into the next one, but I really appreciate all the work that she did for this presentation. Thank you very much, people.
Are there any questions? Oh, okay, one moment. Let's start with you first. You sure?
All right, thank you very much. I'm Tommy. I've been 4 years in Catalyst and same amount of time in Polkadot, and I'll be doing this stuff full time starting next month as a governance coordinator. So very relevant stuff, and I've seen all this happen. So I just wanted to thank you because I can completely agree with everything I've seen here. You have thought about it, and the last slide was most important. Just do it. Put some speed to it and see what happens. Make sure there's parameters that you can tweak later.
Exactly. Thank you.
Thank you very much for all the insight. Are any of these materials available somewhere?
Of course, just write me. We can connect on Telegram. I can send you the slides. Don't worry.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Any more questions? Oh, here, one more.
Would the DREPs be, legally liable for anything that they vote? I mean, is there a risk to becoming a DREP?
Magdalena will correct me. I do not see any kind of decision that you can make as a, because she's a lawyer, that's why. But if I understand right, as a DREP, for the moment you are not making any kind of decision that may have legal consequences because you are only tweaking parameters of, for example, consensus mechanism of rewards. You are not fundamentally altering anything that has a, you are only changing things at the protocol level. So I don't envision any effect of this, if I understand right. Mm-hmm. Yeah. You had the first.
Is there any application for developing the concept?
Application meaning?
Yeah, developing an application that represents all the things you said.
Of course, we are trying to do, the modeling framework that we are developing is exactly that. We are trying to develop a generic framework to model on-chain decision-making processes to exactly see which is the effect that it has in the long-term behavior of the individuals and the community. Because there are some things that Cardano may want to optimize in the long run, like, for example, participation inside of the decision-making process. Try to reduce perhaps the level of abstention or to limit the effect that they may have in some decisions. And you see that it is intertwined because of two aspects. And this is where the things, there is one aspect that you can say is you can change parameters, and parameters may lead, for example, to economic output. And the problem that you have is what happens if what you are deciding are things that benefit specific stakeholders that have a lot of power inside of in the voting, but benefits them from an economic point of view. And this is exactly because we have already all this part about behaviors and staking, we are combining the two because we want to see how the economic loops, do you remember at the beginning I was saying about these feedback loops that you have in decision making? What we want to see is how the social process leads to decision making that leads to economic change that eventually changes once again the social process again and again and again. Disentangling these two things is not trivial at all, but that's why it is an interesting piece of research.
Thank you.
William. Okay.